All electrolyte and hydration mixes and drinks are not created equal. I mean, check the ingredients. They have sugar or sugar alternatives, and there's tons of added stuff. Allow me to introduce you to the best electrolyte mix, Light Balance, LYTE balance.com. It's a naked electrolyte mix, which means no preservatives, no sweeteners, no flavoring, no caffeine or gluten, and no calories. I'm always on the search for the best hydration, and I've found it. My entire family uses it, and I use it on all my runs. It solved all my hydration issues. Your body needs magnesium, potassium, and sodium, which Light Balance conveniently provides in liquid or powder form. Pure, powerful hydration. Light Balance. Go to lytebalance.com. Our guest today on the Mental Toughness podcast is currently assistant coach for the Atlanta Hawks. He was the head coach at the University of Notre Dame from 2000 to 2023, where he holds the record for wins at 483. He's been National Coach of the Year amongst many other honors. He was head coach at Delaware University, assistant for 8 seasons at Duke, as well as a coach underneath Morgan Wooten at Dematha. Our guest today is Coach Mike Brey. Coach, thanks so much, man, for joining us.
Great to be with you, man. Look forward to sharing with you.
So you attended Morgan Wooten's camp like as a 10-year-old, man. Pick us up from that one, because that always like spurned an interest at that point, didn't it?
You know, it really did. So at 10 years old, I went to the Metropolitan Area Basketball School at St. John's High School in Washington, D.C. My first coach at 10 years old was Adrian Dantley. The
Oh, yeah.
Dematha players were the coaches. So Adrian Dantley was my coach. But more importantly, as I spent time at that camp, I was around Morgan Wooten at a very key age, him lecturing. I was around the Dematha players, and those guys were amazing role models. And it got to the point when I was 15, I told my dad, even though he was a public school teacher in Montgomery County, that I really want to go to Dematha and I want to play for Coach Wooten and I want to give it a try. And I was so fortunate with the parents that I had to say, we want to be supportive of that. It's positive, it's good, and let's go give it a shot and go see what you're made of.
That's awesome. I mean, I grew up in Maryland, and so it was always DeMatha and then Dunbar. I mean, those are the two powerhouses, man. So it was always pretty neat.
Well, I hear your Maryland accent a little bit. As a matter of fact, we're both coming across probably with a little Maryland twang. But you're right. Dematha High School, Dunbar of DC. That was the city championship matchup almost year after year in a sold out Cole Fieldhouse. And growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, as you know, it's just great basketball. And you could
Yeah.
always find competition. You could always find motivation. And I was really fortunate to be around that world and then around and be part of the Dematha program as a young person.
No, it's awesome. I always thought that was such a powerhouse until I moved to Indiana, and then Indiana basketball by itself, right? I mean, then 48, 49 other states, it's basketball. In Indiana, it's something else.
Well, you and I talked about this before we started the recording, but I did 23 years in the state of Indiana, and I learned to appreciate high school basketball in the state of Indiana, the coaching, the teaching, and every kid we recruited from Indiana through my Notre Dame time, they all knew how to play because they were well coached.
Yep, absolutely. Um, let's start with Morgan Wooten. After you were done playing, you went and then coached underneath him. I always found, I mean, he had incredible poise as a coach, but what part, and I always feel this is important because people nowadays, like, they know maybe of the name, but I think it's important to like always keep these stories going. But I always felt he had incredible poise. What can you share about throughout your experience?
Well, what a blessing that I played for him. And then when I finished at George Washington University, I came back over. I taught U.S. history. I coached the JV. I was the head coach of the JV. He said, if you want to be a coach, Mike, you got to have your own team. You need to come over here with me. I'm going to give you the JV. You're going to work with me. But the poise part of it was maybe one of the biggest things I've stolen from him in my time with him. He was always very even keeled. He was the ultimate educator, teacher, positive reinforcement. The phrase that I started using at the end of my tenure at Notre Dame with my staff is be a confidence giver, being a confidence giver. And so to be with Coach Wooten then in my early years as a coach was just extremely powerful working alongside him.
You went to, obviously, I mean, then all the schools that are coming there just to recruit as well. And then you went to Duke University with Coach K. You were there for 8 seasons. Now, just a side note before we get into it, I was a big Robert Brickey fan back in the day.
Oh,
I mean, I know you don't hear that a lot, but I loved
no.
watching Robert Brickey play.
There's a name from the past, and certainly here with the Atlanta Hawks, I have Quinn Snyder, who I coached, and Tony Lang, who I coached, and
Nice.
Grant Hill is a part owner. So we have a lot of Duke stories flowing. But Robert Brickey was one of the true, amazingly athletic players. Fayetteville High School, or Fayetteville, North Carolina, came up the road from Fayetteville, and some of the dunks that he had over the top of people are quite memorable. But you mentioned I was so lucky. I've created a network, and Coach Wooten sold this. He said, if you want to go back to college, come with me, because everyone's going to come through to recruit our players, and you're going to get to meet all of them. Lefty Drizel was at Maryland at the time, Terry Holland at Virginia, Dean Smith at North Carolina, certainly Mike Krzyzewski at Duke, Bobby Cremins. And so I developed a relationship more so with the young assistants who were on the road recruiting. And then when Mike Krzyzewski had an opening, fortunately, I think he wanted someone who was going to be with him a while and not just making a pit stop to be a head coach. I needed time, and I came there with Bob Bender, who was the top assistant at the time, and he really taught me the business. And I was fortunate enough to be with Mike K for 8 years, and we went to 6 Final Fours, which is just not reality when I think back.
I mean, you could definitely got spoiled during that time for
No,
sure, man.
no question. No
But I
question.
mean, when you look back though, I mean, there's so many questions I kind of want to ask on that one, but I mean, I just felt like those Duke, from the Danny Ferry time up and through, when Bobby Hurley was there, even thereafter. But I mean, that was just a dynasty in terms of what was built and what took place. What stands out to you, like when you reflect on that time? What really stood out?
The again, I got to be with Morgan Wooten, and then I got to be with Mike Krzyzewski. And one of the things I thought Mike K's greatest strength is handling people, managing people, and getting a group to chase a common goal over the course of a basketball season, which is 5 months, and handling individual and team psyche. He was much more into where are we at mentally, who needs to be challenged, who needs to be hugged, instead of how do we attack the zone defense. And I thought that was his greatest strength. And it was something certainly I learned a lot about before I became head coach at Delaware.
Did during that time, did Quinn Snyder stand out to you, like knowing you're coaching him at that time? What stood out to him at that time is like, wow, this guy's a little bit different in terms of how he approaches things.
Yeah, I got to Duke when Quinn was a junior. He and Danny Ferry were roommates and still extremely close. As a matter of fact, Danny's here in Atlanta, so we catch up a lot. But Quinn was maybe, and I was in college coaching for 35, 40 years, the best leader I've ever been around. And it was interesting because he was moved to point guard his junior year, even though it wasn't natural position. And there were some challenges with that. But the one thing he never lost was his voice, his leadership. He ran the locker room. He ran the team. He roomed with the best player and the player of the year, Danny Ferry, and he knew how to handle him. Quinn Snyder was one of those leaders as a head coach. He handled a lot of stuff you didn't even know about
Hmm.
because he just handled stuff. And I just thought he was an amazing voice. And then as I followed him, and in the interesting dynamic and timing, I left to take the Delaware job. Quinn replaced me as an assistant. He took the job in the opening there, and the rest is history. We've stayed in touch, and it's very neat now to be back working with him 40 years later. We're back working together. And we probably would say, if you talk to us, we say, I don't think we've changed much. We're telling the same stories. We have the same sense of humor, but just the utmost respect for Quinn as far as leadership, brilliant mind, but a big heart and the really big ability to be able to connect with people and players.
So one of the best leaders and of all your years. I mean, it's got to be the best compliment you've probably ever given somebody.
One of the and I'm still trying to get the video because I want to show it to our coaching staff here at Atlanta. One of the things that Mike Krzyzewski did, and I stole it when I went to Delaware and Notre Dame, at the banquet, the seniors spoke. You didn't bring a guest speaker in. Your seniors spoke. Quinn Snyder went for 45 minutes in 1989. It's burned in my mind. There was not a dry eye in the house. He got emotional and he talked from his heart about what the program meant to him. And it was eloquent and passionate and heartfelt. And I walked out that night, I was like, unbelievable. And as a 22-year-old college senior. So there was always something very special about him. People gravitated to him. Everybody wanted to hang with him. And so he is now the ringleader here with all of us in Atlanta.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that, Coach. Um, Another side point that just came to mind. Were you still there when Joe Smith came and played?
Oh, I can remember Joe Smith tipping one in at the buzzer at Cameron.
So, so this is where I said true success means you have to root for everybody. Because again, being a Maryland fan, like Duke fans didn't root for other players, but I remember that game and they actually clapped for him. They actually like appreciated what kind of game that he had and they cheered for him. I said, that is true success, being able to root for somebody else.
Well, you and I have another thing in common. I'm a diehard Maryland basketball fan. Went to Lefty Drizel's camp growing up in Rockville, Maryland, watching John Lucas, Mo Howard, and Brad Davis, the three-guard offense that was so famous back in the 70s. But if you remember in that game, Billy Hahn was coaching because Gary had pneumonia.
Oh,
And
okay.
Pete Gaudette was coaching because Mike Kay was ill. The two assistants were running it, and Joe Smith tipped it in at the buzzer after having an amazing game. And you're right. As I think back now, I think like the Duke fans almost were like the tip of the cap in golf. Like, okay, man, you were
Yeah.
unbelievable tonight. It was like 28, 17 rebounds, 5 block shots. But those Maryland teams, obviously with Joe, were certainly in Keith Booth and Johnny Rhodes and Dwayne
That was it.
Simpkins, former
Yep.
Dematha product. Those were great Maryland teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that one, Coach. Well, let's talk about you moving forward. You took at kind of a hinge moment. You turned down the Auburn job and you took the Delaware job. So it's always like, how did you know, like in your gut, hey, this is going to be a better fit?
It was interesting. We were on a run in the NCAA tournament and actually played against the big dog in Purdue in Knoxville, Tennessee in the regional and beat them to get to the Final Four. And in the meantime, I was involved with the Auburn job, SEC job. I'm an assistant coach. It kind of blows your mind a little bit. And I just probably could never get comfortable with that being a great fit. And in our profession, in this coaching profession, strategic moves are probably a key, or your coaching career can end, or you're going to go backwards. And I decided I didn't think it was a great fit. I did not move forward with it. I think they did hire the right person. They hired Cliff Ellis, who had just left Clemson, and he was a perfect fit for Auburn. So I go back to Duke and I go another year, and then I take the Delaware job. And for a while in the profession, people were, that is the dumbest move I've ever seen, Mike. You
Right.
turned down an SEC job to go to Delaware, but I thought at Delaware, it was in my region, the Mid-Atlantic. I had contacts. I knew where I could go to get players, but it also was a place where I knew I was going to make a lot of mistakes, but I was making them in front of maybe 2,000 people instead of on ESPN at Auburn. And it turned out to be, kind of the right move. And I got to Delaware at a great time with great support. And then we recruited the heck out of DC, Baltimore, New Jersey, and Philly.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Jay Wright wasn't there yet, so weren't competing against him.
Yeah.
So
Well,
just
Jay
John
had
Chaney.
actually, no, he was not at Villanova, but Jay was at Hofstra. So
Oh,
we
okay.
were
Yeah.
we were in the America East together, and so we were banging heads there at the end, and we had won it 2 years in a row. And then we went to the third championship game, and who knocked us out? Jay Wright, Speedy Claxton, and Hofstra. And then
Oh,
I
yeah.
said, it's time to go. I'm going to Notre Dame.
Right. Right. We, in college, and then we used to go to Dewey Beach all the time.
Oh.
You know, so we don't need to tell any of those stories. But
Well,
those are some fun times.
Well, I had a place in Rehoboth for a long time. I just couldn't get back to it enough when I was living in South Bend, Indiana. But being at the University of Delaware and certainly being a DC, Maryland guy, Rehoboth, Dewey, Bethany are fun spots. I still get back a bunch and see that gang there, and you can't go to Dewey without going to the Starboard and
That's
seeing
it, man.
Monty.
That's right. That's right. That's hilarious. I love it, Coach. Um, with Before we get to Notre Dame and that hinge moment, talk to us about you're at Delaware. You're allowed to fail. And what I mean by that is kind of what you alluded to, right? I mean, it's not on ESPN. There's not so much, I mean, obviously there's pressure, but you're allowed to fail. Can you just talk to us about like how much of that development do you think was important?
I think it was really a key. I had been a head coach, but only at the JV level at Dematha. But as Coach Wooten said, he was prophetic. It helped me because I had my own team, and I had to write the practice plan, and I had to handle the 15 young men that I had, and all of that was really helpful a little bit as I went to Delaware. But you can say you think you're ready, but when you slide over, into that head coaching seat and what comes with it, and the responsibility with it, it is stressful. It takes a lot of energy, and I guess my biggest thing was try to take it day to day. I had some great advice from Mike Krzyzewski and Morgan Wooten. They were great mentors still as I was, learning how to be a head coach, pacing yourself, being positive, being yourself, establishing your identity. I had two very strong mentors that had their own identity. Who was I going to be as I became a head coach? But our first 2 years, we were about 500. And now you're getting into year three. And in the coaching profession, in year three, they're kind of like, well, are we going to make a run here? Can we get to the NCAA tournament? Or, and fortunately, we won the America East in year three with two Dematha kids. Mike Pegues was a great low post player for us. And that, and we kind of went on from there. So, but it was a learning experience. I got more confident. I learned to delegate better as I became a more experienced head coach. I think if I look back, I tried to do everything my first couple of years. I wasn't as secure to delegate to staff. And I think I tell a lot of young head coaches, learn to delegate, you gotta back off it because you can't do everything. You need some help.
Right. You're at the beach house July 7th and you pick up the paper about Roy Williams turned down the North Carolina job. Could you pick us up from there, Coach?
Oh man, that's one of the great memories. What was that, about 25 years ago? Um, it's interesting because the year before, in 1999, I had just finished year 4 at Delaware. We had won the league in year 3 and 4. We were rolling. We had a good group back. We had momentum. It was a good run. I interviewed for the Georgia job and the Notre Dame job in 1999. Matt Doherty got the Notre Dame job. I turned down the Georgia job because I thought Notre Dame would be a better fit, and I waited. And Georgia moved on and hired Jim Herrick. So I'm back at Delaware, and I had a good team, and I'm like, okay, well, we'll go back. And never did you think Notre Dame would open again, because Matt Doherty was a young coach coming from Kansas as an assistant.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, Roy Williams in the summer, a year later, says he doesn't want to go back to North Carolina. There's only one guy in the family that's ready to do it. They bring Matt back. And all of a sudden, a year later, I'm back in the mix at Notre Dame. There's a new AD, and end up getting the job in the middle of July. It moved so fast, and then was able to spend 23 years there. So it is amazing in our business when the dominoes start to fall in the coaching profession, how it can affect everybody. And I always would tell Roy, hey, man, thanks for turning the Carolina job down, because Matt left and I was able to slide to Notre Dame.
Yeah. No, I love it, Coach. These hinge moments with I want to talk about your experience at Notre Dame and then things that you have found out throughout the years. Um, could you set this for us? Because I always felt Lou Holtz had the best quote about Notre Dame, and that was, if you haven't been there, then no explanation can suffice. But if you have been there, then no explanation is necessary. Can you just talk about like just the overall, pageantry that in type of athletes and experience of Notre Dame?
Well, as I tell people, it was the honor of my lifetime to be the head coach there for 23 years, to be part. And I was you can't be successful there unless you're a believer in the mission. And the one thing about Notre Dame, even through the midst of all the different things that have gone on in college athletics, and there's certainly a lot going on now, it was about a young person getting a degree, priorities in line. Certainly, there was pressure to win and be successful. But there were some things at Notre Dame that were non-negotiable. You weren't going to change it. You ain't needed to understand this is how we do business. And I embraced it. I loved it. And I thought what it did was it earmarked a clientele, meaning prospects, recruits, that were really motivated, special young men that knew what they were getting into. I mean, I didn't trick anybody into coming to Notre Dame. I would say, hey, look, school's hard. School's going to be really hard here. But, that degree and that investment is really more of a 40-year investment if you
Right.
become a Notre Dame grad, not 4. And so I was looking back this past summer. I've had 78 guys in 23 years come through, play for me, and get their degree. That's a lot of sons out there. I mean, now
Absolutely.
I'm going to Johnny Mooney's wedding this summer. I'm seeing these guys, their children. Torrey Jackson in Detroit the other night. He's a high school coach. I'm with him and his family. I mean, that's what it was all about. So
Right. I was getting ready to say that's a lot of weddings, Coach.
that's a lot of weddings. I've been
Yeah.
to a lot of them, and but it was an amazingly special place, and I was so honored to be part of it for 23 years.
I've had a coach that said, you're not coaching them for 4 years, and you've kind of alluded to it. I mean, you're coaching them for life, and the real success comes when you are going to be a guest at their wedding, when you see them develop. Um, could you just share with us, in terms of the coaching piece and the relationship that you would build with players? Because it wasn't one and done players that were coming there. They stayed for all 4 years and graduated. But talk to us about that relationship, how that developed, and the true success of coaching.
I think the thing that's I think it was Morgan Wooten who said, they're not going to remember, you young people, they don't necessarily remember their teachers, but they'll never forget their coach. And, those 78 young men that have come through, still to this day, I'll get one or two calls a week. One is a celebratory call. I'm getting married. And many times I'll get a call where a young man is in crisis. And now all of a sudden he's 35 years old. He played for me 20 years ago, but that's the relationship. And I hope they feel, I think they do, that I'm here for them, man. And that was part of the recruiting process. And I think they felt when they played for me, you really got to know them and cared about them. And so, to be invited to their weddings, to see them, to get text messages. Last night we beat Boston in a great game. I must have had 8 of my guys text me like, "Yo, coach, what a great road win, man." So that's what it's all about. As an educator and a teacher and a coach is the relationships. And when they come back and they say, "God, coach, I appreciate," remember the time, how many times does it happen when you're a teacher and you're in education and a former student will come back and go, "God, remember that time you told me," and you don't remember it, but
Right.
you've had so many, but the impact you had at that moment was, and I think I love your phrase, hinge moments. I'm going to
Hmm.
steal that. I think
You got it, coach.
I like it, and that's what being an educator is all about. And I think it helped me that I started as a high school educator. And you develop those relationships, and they feel free to always connect with you.
Absolutely. I always say hinge moments because every door has a hinge,
Yeah.
and a door without a hinge, the wall just doesn't work.
I love it. You're gonna see that come up again. I'm gonna use that. I like it.
Well, I'm going to send you the book then too,
Send
coach.
me
You
to,
got it.
please, please.
The with the reason why that came up, coach, about the hinge is I was always fascinated by John Wooden and how he was going to take the job at Minnesota. And I'm sure you know that story, right? Like
Great, great
going to
story.
take that job story and they're going to turn down this school from the West Coast. And Minnesota didn't call. UCLA calls, he accepts it, and it's like, Coach, I'm so sorry. There was a snowstorm that was here. Our university official couldn't get to it. We still want you to be the head coach of Minnesota.
It,
Thinking they backed out, and then everything was different.
it's like if I go to Auburn, I don't think I would have been successful. And luckily, I dodged the bullet. I didn't get, you know, blindsided by SEC job or money because I don't think I would have made it long term. Delaware was more of a long term move, and then not going to Georgia and maybe not going to Vanderbilt when had some offers when I was at Delaware, and Notre Dame being that's the one. And
Hmm.
so those, luckily those hinges were well oiled and they worked real good
Yeah.
when those moments came. But it is so fragile at those crossroads. There's no
Right.
question.
So, Coach, one of the pieces I'll definitely talk about in order for the hinge to connect is you have to be able to trust your gut. When it comes to coaching, and that I mean, especially now, but even I mean, if you can kind of reflect, because there's so much analytics that are now like, give us an example how well, because you even spoke to it, you have to be yourself when you are a coach. How well did you do that? Being able just to trust your gut and allow situations to unfold, being patient.
Well, the interesting thing you talk about, you mentioned analytics, and in this league, as I found in a short tenure here, a year and a half in the NBA, oh my God, are there numbers being thrown around? And I've had to back off and even talk to some of the young staff and say, why don't we push that aside? And what do we feel? What are we seeing? What do we and even at my years at Notre Dame at the end, analytics certainly was big into college basketball. But I think you always have to have the gut feel and the confidence to whether it's in a coaching move, whether it's in recruiting. I think that's the kid we should offer, not that kid. And luckily at Notre Dame we got that right most of the time, but we're not undefeated. Made some mistakes there too,
Sure.
and then you go back and go, why did we fumble that one? But I think your gut instinct, your feel for people, your feel for things. That you have to have confidence in your gut. If you're looking at numbers and you're listening maybe too much to the outside stuff, eventually, man, you gotta what's it feel like? I was fortunate enough that I think the two guys that I came under, Morgan Wooten and Mike Krzyzewski, were great gut feel people, relationship feel people. They developed deep relationships, so they had a feel for where people were at all the time.
Yeah. In terms of mental toughness, what were some of the characteristics that you saw from athletes? And it could have been some of your athletes or just athletes in general. What were a couple of those things that stood out to you in terms of um this they kind of had that it factor?
You look at it, and mental toughness is talked about so much in sport now, right? The ability to bounce back after disappointment. Maybe one of the things that I thought was so cool about us beating the Celtics last night was we blew an 18-point lead against the Bulls on Saturday night and felt like dogs for 48 hours. And for this group to go into Boston and then kind of bounce back and do it, I think it was a great moment of growth for us. The ability. What is? I'm a big body language reader guy. What is a young person's body language after a mistake, after a missed shot, being taken out of the game, and how do they move on and get on to the next play? So to speak. And there's no question, as a coach and the leader, when you stand up in front of your group, you have to show, especially in a 3-game, 4-game losing streak. And sometimes you got to dig down deep. And even sometimes you may have to fake it a little bit when you're standing up in front. You may not be the most confident, but you walk in the room and all eyes are on you. You better generate some stuff that, hey, we're fine. We're going to move on. We're going to bounce back. I think it's always important for the leader to say, I need to do a better job. I've made some mistakes with you. Here's how we're going to attack it, but we need to be better. I've always felt that humility when you're up in front of your group, asking them to do stuff. If you can point the finger at yourself and they kind of know, like, well, man, coach has got us, man. He's got our back.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, coach. Did real specific when it comes to practice and when you were in the middle of the season and the energy when it comes to practice, what were some of the things you did that, because we always talk about the importance of that, having your players bring it, of course, but what were some of the things you noticed about when energy would kind of lag, and how were you able to bring that back up?
I think, one of the things became very mindful of quickly is, in a college coaching job, your guys are in class until 3 or 4 o'clock. A lot of times you practice in the afternoon. Some teams now are practicing in the morning, but you're doing a lot during the day as the head coach. A lot of times you're putting out some fires, academics, raising money, staff meeting. I always felt like I've got to be really good 3 to 5. And I may not have all the best juice today. Didn't sleep good. Maybe we lost a couple, whatever. I'm not feeling great. Got the flu. But I'll tell you what, when I walk into that with my whistle on and they turn the head and here he comes, they better see some juice and some positivity and some energy, and you're bumping guys up. And you can pass out at 5 o'clock after they leave. You can go, pass out then. But I think it's all generated from the leader. There's no question about it. So I was always mindful of my demeanor, how I came across in that practice session, which was so important. There are things that, some teaching techniques that we discovered I loved. Getting a group to talk sometimes and communicate is a big hurdle. Maybe the first hurdle you want to climb. Will a team talk to each other on the defensive end, on the offensive end? Will a guy pump a guy up when somebody makes a mistake and that type of thing? Sometimes I would go through the first 15, 20 minutes of practice and I told the staff, don't say anything. I want them to generate the talk. And some days it was popping and they're kind of having ownership of it and talking. And there are other days where you're like, wow, there's a problem, and you may have to stop and address it. But it's I think when you can get a group to take ownership of itself, man, is that so powerful. And I think back to my best groups at Notre Dame, there was an ownership from the leadership.
Not to get too far ahead, but I mean the teams with Jerry and Grant and Pat Connaughton, were these the teams that you were referring
Oh,
to?
man,
And
there's the greatest example, Doc.
great.
No question.
Go ahead.
Pat
Now you can
Connaughton,
go. I just want to know that I wanted you to know that I did my research, and of
you
course I was always
did.
following it, and
You
but I
did.
paid attention to those teams.
Yes, they were a fun group, ACC champions in 2015 in the Elite Eight. But Pat Connaughton and Jaron Grant ran that group. They ran the locker room. I tell coaches, I say, let me ask you something. Who's selling your stuff when you ain't around? Who's selling my stuff when I ain't around? Pat Connaughton and Jaron Grant did. Ben Hansbrough did back in 2011. Luke Herringody did to 2008. You can go through it, and with the Hawks right now, we're kind of nurturing that a little bit. A guy like Larry Nance Sr., or a
Mhm.
junior, who had a great game last night, a veteran, new to us. Oh, a needed voice, and selling the message when Quinn's not talking. Really powerful stuff. But when they take ownership and they feel they own it, man, I think you're more than 70% of the way there.
That's what we always talk about, because I hate the word buy-in. I'm just not a fan of it, Coach. I like ownership, because buy-in means I'm having some people buy into my vision that you have. I want you to take ownership. Like when you own a house, it's a lot different than renting it.
It's a great way of putting it. For example, I was telling some of the young staff, and here at Atlanta, they were asking about my Notre Dame teams, and I said, when you have a Jaron Grant and Pat Connaughton, there were days I would see them early in the afternoon and go, "Hey, what do you think we should do in practice today?" Well, Coach, I think we need to hit these three things. Done. Done. We got it. You own it. And so, I think it was always being reinforced that this is your team, man. Tell
Mhm.
me what we need to work on. Let me help you. And so, but ownership over buy-in, that's a key. That's a better phrase. Totally agree, Doc.
I knew last year we won the state championship in Indiana with Fishers basketball, and there were a couple of factors that went into it. One, Garrett Weiniger, just incredible coach, but there was an issue with the player at 3 o'clock one day, and all the coaches then were in there, and the leader of the team, Keenan Gardner, who's now playing D1 basketball, said, and didn't really even say anything, but just ran through everything and then started doing practice. And I kind of pulled him aside later. It was about 30 minutes. And I
Huh.
said, this is your team. You know it's your team. But I said, that what you did there, I said, that was special. Can you lead when coaches aren't around and when people aren't watching?
There's the greatest example of it. And then you had to feel good. And by the way, the Fishers program is one of the most respected programs in the state of Indiana. I know that for sure firsthand. But actually, the moments I get goosebumps are not when you think back of the buzzer going off in the ACC championship. Yeah, those are great. Don't get me wrong. But when you see that leadership or ownership and a young man steps up and speaks, or in the midst of a meeting goes, "Coach, could I interrupt? I'd like to add." And you go, "Yeah, we got a chance, man. We got a
Yep.
chance."
No, I love that. Um, One more basketball thing, Coach. It always seemed like, especially at Notre Dame, that it always seemed like you let your offenses I mean, they were always freed up. Is that was one of your philosophies when you were coaching?
Really was. I think I evolved into that at Delaware. Jay Billis, I thought, and I took it as the ultimate compliment. I used it in recruiting. He said, "Man, your guys play with a free mind." We recruited skilled offensive kids that knew how to play. We were all pretty good at shooting it. We really banged the drum on assist to turnover. The ball is gold. We want to take care of it. You'll love this. Finally, my last couple of years, I had a sign up in the locker room. I tried to you simplify your philosophy. And my philosophy was, there was a picture of me and it said, don't skip class. Don't throw the ball away. You and I will get along just fine. Period.
Yep.
That was it. That's all. That was my first team meeting. And keeping it simple. But we did. I think you wanted guys to play with a free mind. I remember Scott Martin from Valpo, who I got on a transfer from Purdue. He told me one time when he was on my staff, he said, Coach, when I got to you, you told me, he said, don't you even look at the bench when you're playing. If you look at me, I'm going to be pissed off. You just play. He goes, God, man, I needed that, Coach. So, you wanted guys to play and be free and be confident. And it was neat to hear that, guys felt that way. And, if you missed 3 shots, you weren't afraid to take the next one. I told Chris Quinn once, my first recruit at Notre Dame, now the top assistant with the Miami Heat, because he was almost overly fundamental as an Ohio kid. Everything was almost. I told him one day, I said, Chris, if you don't take a bad shot in the first 5 minutes of practice, I'm going to throw you out. And he looked at me like, what? I said, loosen up, my man. Take a fadeaway a little bit. I need you going for it. And so, we did have a little bit of a swagger offensively. And we wanted guys, a phrase I would say was, let it rip, man. Let's let it rip.
Yep. I look now at a lot of kids playing, and if they're looking in the stands at their parents. It just happens so often, man.
It really does, Doc. It's at my last couple summers in recruiting, and I know the parents feel the pressure because the coaches are there and are they going to get an offer and where are they ranked and all those things. But even at Notre Dame, so we used to, if you remember, timeouts, we would move the chair out and we would put, a lot of people were putting the stools, but the kids were facing the stands and my back was to the stands. Well, their parents were back there. And I would be talking to the 5 starters and I would see their eyes, they're looking above me. They're not looking at me. And they're looking at, and they'd be like, oh, sorry. And I'm like, we flipped it. I said, no way. Flip it. I want them on the bench, old school, looking at me. I'm sitting with my back to the court because of that right there. It is a factor in this generation. It's part of the equation, and you better be ready to manage it.
Herb Sendek once said at a conference, he said during the timeouts, they could probably remember like one piece of information.
Yeah.
Did you kind of agree with that?
I agree. There can be an error. You can overcoach. And I felt at the end of my head coaching, undercoach them a little bit. And even here in this league, because you have all the time to dive into basketball, you're not recruiting, you're not raising NIL. It's all basketball, which I've really enjoyed in the NBA. But you can overcoach it now. You could go down some rabbit holes. I told one of the young staff last year, they said, what's the difference? I said, look, I love it because it's all B-ball. But I said, I'll say this, man, do you guys go down some rabbit holes? And I said, how about we bring that back, and instead of the 7 things, we give them 2. And so I think in timeouts too, I love getting into a timeout and they were already talking. And if it was Connaughton and Grant kind of and then, and I'd be like, great point. I mean, I was just, oh, that's another good point. Anything else? Let's get out of here. They handled the timeout. I didn't need to say anything.
Yeah, no, I love that. One of the lines that I used, Coach, and this was from Jeff Van Gundy, but he always said, especially during his Knicks days, that we would talk about all stressful situations in non-stressful environments. So I try to coach that way in terms of helping out parents, helping out coaches. But I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that, because what he said is we don't talk about who's going to be taking the shot. We've already talked about it the night before. And that was a stressful situation with 3 seconds left. So can you talk about that, but all stressful situations in non-stressful environments?
Well, it's interesting you say that. As a coach, we always would do 1 or 2 game situations in practice. Down 3, up 3, have to get the ball in bounds, make free, and you would do them, and you'd try to give a variety of them. And darn, it would show up all of a sudden the next night, the situation presents itself. And you go into the timeout, and I said, fellas, did we just do this? Like, oh, coach, we did this yesterday. I go, we did this one yesterday. We're good, man. And just to sell them and remember, we're going to do this and do that. And so that's a great point, trying to have them prepared and confident to like, we've seen this, we've done this, and that type of thing. You talk about non-stressful situations. I was always trying to, if I met with a player, I tried to not meet with them in my office sometimes where that power dynamic is there. I'm walking on the court. I just worked out. I'm sweating a little bit. Hey, come over. Jimmy, come on over. Let's sit here. And maybe there's some things you need to really address, but you're doing it in a more relaxed atmosphere and the power dynamic of me. Many times after a game, I would come in sometimes when it was a tough locker room, tough loss, maybe we're in a tough stretch. Instead of standing in front of them, I would pull up a stool and I sat so I was eye level. I was eye level with them all. I sat. I wasn't standing, walking around. And I'm like, fellas, we're in it. And I got to be better, So I was always conscious of that dynamic of, how to communicate with them that way. But yeah, trying to take the stress off, smiling. Yeah, people would say, Coach, you're funny. You were so calm on the sideline. I said, I wasn't inside, but I knew outwardly everybody was watching.
Yeah, body language doesn't talk, it screams.
Yeah, great way of putting it.
Coach, I mean, we could keep talking for hours, and I appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of it. I always ask this question, but what question should I be asking that I just haven't asked or I've forgotten to ask?
No, I love some of the stuff we're touching on here. It's it's such a relationship. Yeah, I'll go back to a Morgan Wooten line that he used to tell us when we worked his camp, and he used to say it. And I never understood it when I was young until I had children. He used to say, and it sounds so darn corny, but I really tried to live by it. Be the kind of coach you want your own son and daughter to play for. And I think back, and I had a son who played college football, daughter played volleyball, and I think back and I go, you know what? That's a pretty darn good place to start as far as how you handle the young people that you are given and in charge of. And man, are they, you really have a responsibility when you have a young person, and but be the kind of coach you want your own son and daughter to play for. And I was like, I got you, coach. That's a good way to start things.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Coach. I did have one more question then. How did coaching different from you being a parent?
I was probably very conscious because I dealt with parents as a high school coach at Dematha, certainly at Duke as an assistant. As an assistant in college, you're a little more the lightning rod of the parents to take it off the head coach. Tommy, Erica, and I took a lot of lightning over our years at Duke. Well worth it. Well worth it. But that was our role. Delaware, Notre Dame, it was always a dynamic that I think you're really conscious of. When my son started playing CYO basketball in Wilmington, Delaware, I was so paranoid. I sat in the top bleacher with a hat on, and I never said a word after a game unless he brought something up. We went and got some ice cream and went home. Thankfully, Doc, he played football, and I don't know a darn thing about football, so I could never screw him up. But I was always conscious because I had dealt with many great parents, don't get me wrong, but some that you just felt sorry for the young person. And I was like, I am gonna just be supportive. And I was lucky, Doc. My dad was a high school educator. My mom was an educator. My parents were unbelievably supportive. I don't ever, my dad remember, like, I can't believe you turned it over like that, tonight. It was, how you doing? You good? Man, it was, so I had a great example in my home life And then I have some great examples. I mentioned Chris Quinn. I used to tell his father, I want you to do a podcast seminar on how to be a parent. You know, he was like, Mike, he's yours. Coach him up. Don't let him complain. And don't you call me. And I told him not to call me either.
Love it.
But it is part of the equation, and how we manage a young person and those relationships with their parents. Those are things you have to work through as the head coach, because it's part of the equation.
Yeah. Coach, thank you so much for your time, insight. Really appreciate that, man.
Well, great to be with you, man. I'm a fellow Marylander. Hopefully, I get crab cakes sent to Atlanta. Hopefully, you get them sent to Indy.
Well, I just don't eat them here. Whenever I'm heading back to Eastern Shore, I mean, but that's when I'll hit them up.
Yeah, I got a good fill this summer. I was up there Labor Day weekend. I got my one last shot of them, but you know, it really good to be with you.
Absolutely.
If you get through Atlanta, please stay in touch, and maybe I'll see you when we have to deal with the Pacers.
Thank you, Coach.
Take care.